Hello everybody and welcome to the ERS member talks about our latest report, Here to Stay, 2 decades of proportional representation in Britain. My name is Darren Hughes. I'm the Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society, and tonight we thought would be a really good opportunity to talk to our members about this latest report, which we think sets out the case very strongly for the success of PR in parts of Britain that hadn't had it previously, and therefore sets out the case for why we need to make that big change at Westminster to bring proportional representation across the whole of the United Kingdom. This ERS members event is exclusively for our ERS members, which is, I'm grateful to say, a growing band of people. So thank you to our members for your continuing support to us. And we're also joined tonight by some people who are supporters of ours, but were very generous donors to this report. And so we've invited them along as well tonight. But this is one of the, hopefully one of the benefits of membership is the ability to have some of these ERS member talks that we've been doing to go over some of the detail. This is in Zoom webinar format tonight. So if you're unfamiliar with that, it means you don't need to worry about your camera because no one can see you. You'll only be able to see the panelists whom I'll introduce shortly, but it means that you don't need to worry about mute or cameras in that way that you might in other Zoom formats you have been on. Just so you know, we're also recording the webinar, and that might not seem relevant if your camera is not on, but that's because we will be having a Q&A session at the end of towards the end of the webinar, and we'd encourage you to go down to your screen where there's the opportunity, or up at the top, depending on what device you're using, for the Q&A button, and there you can write questions. And we encourage you to do that throughout the time that the webinar is going, so that we can order those and hopefully get through as many as we can before our time together comes away. And sometimes if the questions are a little technical, it might take a while to type. So don't hesitate in getting those out. The worst thing that can happen is that your question is answered by somebody as they're speaking beforehand. So we'll hope you'll be happy to do that. The other 2 colleagues who will be joining me tonight are the report's author, Ian Simpson, who wrote the report Here to Stay. Ian specialises in the analysis of election survey and polling data, and spent nearly a decade primarily working on the British Social Attitude Survey. So he's been well placed to go over the numbers of the last 6 sets of elections that this report covers in Scotland, Wales, and in London. And he'll shortly do a presentation on the report. And then we're also going to be joined by Jess Blair, who's the Director for ERS Cymru. Jess has been with the Society since 2017 in that role, and previously had time with organisations like the Institute for Welsh Affairs. So for a long time now, she's been at the front line of a lot of the changes that have been taken at Cardiff Bay for the people of Wales. So it'd be really good to talk with her during this time about some of the further changes that are coming up, and then we'll have a chance for a Q&A. So we'll get the whole thing wrapped up in less than an hour. There's a lot of ground to cover. I guess one question is, why the report? Why did we decide to do this? I think in a lot of ways, we write reports about first past the post elections and show all the problems with them. So it was actually quite nice to be able to write a report that showed the benefits of proportional representation. It is in Britain because Northern Ireland obviously has used the single transferable vote, STV, for many decades. But this covers 3 sets of elections for the London Assembly, for the Welsh Assembly as it was, now the Senedd, and the Scottish Parliament. We also wanted to show that it works, that 20 years of this kind of way of doing politics has worked, and as time's gone on, that's been both for the politicians and the political class, the media, but most importantly of all, for the public, for the people, for the citizens who get to have a better chance of their vote being matched by seats. And we wanted to show us on that point that it's brought us closer to it, not the whole way, and we'll go through why we're not nearly as close as the place we'd rather be, where seats match votes comprehensively, but certainly we'll also show how it's far better than the Westminster first past the post. And then the other reason is that we wanted to be able to help have a report in our arsenal of campaign material that shows that there's a process for further change, that shows that in these devolved political institutions, that it's changed the political culture, and that once that change is started, further changes come along, and we'll touch on some of those because they cut across to the society's main goals quite significantly, which is good. And then the other slightly unusual motivation is that it provides a powerful counter argument. People who oppose reform often do it incredibly politely. They'll say things like, well, look, that sounds great, all very well and good, and your numbers probably make sense, and I guess it's not the best system, but what you're proposing, as worthy as it might be, it'll be all just too confusing for the public. We might as well stick with what we know. Now, of course, if you're explaining first past the post to somebody from a proportional representation democracy, they'd throw up their hands in the air and say, you do what? But it's because it's been so predominant of recent times in the UK for Westminster, that becomes an argument that is the easy way out. So actually, we wanted to show that PR is normal for millions of voters and has been for a long time and has worked well and will continue to work well. And that what we now look down the barrel of is further changes happen, particularly in Wales, which we'll come on to later. It does leave English voters quite isolated in the sense of democratic rights and effective representation across the union. So that's the introduction as to why we went ahead and wrote this report. We released it on the 31st of July, which was the 20th anniversary of the legislation. Which was not, it was the anniversary of the date of the legislation coming into effect at Westminster for the referendums to be held in Scotland and Wales. And we thought that was a good anniversary to mark. And also on that date, the 31st of July, there was a Make Noise for PR day of action organised by our colleagues at Make Votes Matter. And so our contribution as ERS was to release this research report, which we hope will be used in future campaigning by everyone who's interested in achieving change away from first past the post at the House of Commons. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Ian Simpson, the author of the report, to take us through his findings. Thanks, Ian.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Darren, and thanks very much for everyone for tuning in this evening. Hopefully you can see my screen here, my slides shared with you. And thanks again for all your support, which helps us to be able to produce reports like this. I just want to share a bit of a flavour of the report with you tonight. Obviously, it's quite a long report, and please, if this piques your interest, please do have a read of the full report. But as Darren said, I think sometimes we can become really focused on the goal of PR for Westminster, which is obviously a really, really important goal for us and a big challenge. But I think it's also worth just stepping back and sometimes looking back at what we have managed to achieve over the last couple of decades. And it can be easy to forget that pre-1999, there were 0 PR elections taking place in Britain at any level of government. So to go from that situation to the current situation now, it's a very different landscape. And I think it's just worth reflecting on that, and can give us hopefully a bit of a boost in terms of our future campaigning. So what I'm going to do tonight is just quickly give a bit of an overview about what has happened in relation to PR in each of the 3 nations of Britain over the last 20 years or so, and then go on to explore a few of the bits of data from the report, which we use to highlight how the elections for the devolved assemblies produce much fairer outcomes for voters than first past the post at Westminster. So if I just kick off. Oh. There we go. So starting with Scotland, as Darren mentioned, there's been 6 Scottish Parliament elections held since the first one back in 1999, and all 6 of them have been held using the additional member system of proportional representation. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the AMS system in a minute, And it's important to note that the AMS system is the system that's used across all of the devolved bodies that we'll be talking about tonight. So that's the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senedd and the London Assembly. Now in Scotland, in addition to this, PR has been further embedded at a local authority level. So following the second Labour Liberal Democrat Scottish coalition government that was formed in 2003, the Scottish Parliament passed legislation which ensured that for local elections in Scotland, they were moved from taking place under first past the post to then taking place under the single transferable vote system, or STV, which is actually the ERS's preferred system of proportional representation. So we were obviously delighted about that reform. And since 2007, there's now been 3 sets of local elections in Scotland held under STV, and the next set will be held next May in 2022. And in all of those elections, voters are now getting a much more proportional results than they were under first past the post. So their views are much better represented across local government in Scotland. Moving on to Wales, as I mentioned, the Senedd also uses the AMS system. And as Darren said, the first election was in 1999 as the Welsh Assembly. It's since changed its name to the Senedd. Again, AMS used in all 6 elections. But some more recent developments in Wales, which my ERS Cymru colleague Jess will talk about in more detail. But these are 2 quite significant developments and ones that we're very happy about. So in recent years, there's been 2 reports into possible electoral reform of the Senedd itself. And both of those reports have recommended that the Senedd increase from 60 members to between 80 and 90 members. And this is to reflect the fact that the Senedd has taken on a lot more powers and responsibilities since it was set up as the Assembly. So it needs more members to do its job properly. And both of those reports have also recommended that the Senedd should be elected by STV, which is obviously something we wholeheartedly support. We're cautiously optimistic that following the recent May 2021 Senedd election that this reform will be taken forward. We're hopeful of that, and Jess will speak more about that. The other really good development is that the Senedd last year passed legislation which will mean that from next May, after the next set of Welsh local elections, Welsh local authorities will be permitted to move from first past the post to using STV, Welsh councillors to try and promote them to consider taking this step. And again, Jess can speak more about that. Finally, looking at England, I think it's fair to say that there's been less progress in England than in Scotland and Wales, but there still has been some. So since 2000, the London Assembly has been elected using the additional member system. And again, there's been 6 elections now using that system. Also, the supplementary votes, while not a proportional system in itself, it is still a preferential system and something that we consider preferable to first past the post. And this has been used for the election of directly elected mayors since 2000, when the first elected mayor of London election took place. And indeed, it's also been used for the election of police and crime commissioners. Unfortunately, the Home Secretary has recently announced the government's intention to move away from using SV for London Mayor, Combined Authority Mayor and PCC elections and move back to first past the post. So this is just a reminder that we do need to be aware of the possibility of backsliding towards first past the post. And as Darren said, this would be a great shame for voters in England who would be a bit isolated and less well represented than their Scottish and Welsh counterparts. So, as I said, moving on to just discussing a bit more detail about the additional member system or AMS system, which is the system used in the Scottish Parliament, the Senedd and the London Assembly. It's a very straightforward system. There are two types of seats available under this system. So you do have the first past the post seats, which are elected in the same way as Westminster seats. So the person who receives the most votes in each seat is elected. But crucially, you also have the additional member seats, and it's these seats which are elected on a party list basis, which go towards making the overall outcome of the elections much more representative. And we'll see that in action in a minute with some examples from the recent elections. It's also important to point out that while all three of these bodies do use the AMS system, there are some differences between them. So obviously, each of the bodies has a different number of seats in total, with the Scottish Parliament having the most with 129 and the London Assembly the fewest with 25. But perhaps more important to note in this slide is the proportion of the seats that are first past the post seats and party list seats. So in the Scottish Parliament and London Assembly, there's around 56–57% of seats that are the first past the post seats. But in the Senedd, this rises by 10 percentage points to around 67%. And this does have implications for the proportionality of the results, as we'll see in a bit. It's harder for the party list seats in the Senedd to make the result as proportional as possible. And we'll see that the results in the Senedd have been slightly less proportional than the votes in the Scottish Parliament and the London Assembly. So having given that context, I'm just going to move on to share some of the data that we have highlighted in the report. So looking at Scotland first, this slide shows the results in just the first past the post seats at the recent Scottish election. What you can see is that the SNP absolutely dominated these first past the post seats, winning 85% nearly on the basis of nearly 48% of the vote, so under half the votes cast. And this is the type of the result that we've become used to seeing in Scotland at Westminster elections, where all the seats are elected under first past the post, particularly in 2015 when the SNP won all but 3 of the Scottish seats at Westminster based on just under half of the votes. And this isn't to criticise the SNP in any way. They have, despite the first past the post currently working to their benefit, they've been a consistent advocate of proportional representation at all levels of government. But it's just to show how the first past the post outcomes can be very distorted. And as you can see here, if the Scottish Parliament election had been based on first past the post, then pretty much all of the other parties would have been more or less blown out of the water by the SNP, and those parties which represent 52% of the votes would have hardly received any representation. However, when we then look at the overall result of the Scottish Parliament election in May, we can see a very different picture. We can see that what we've got here is the total overall number of MSPs elected, the percentage, and the regional vote for that party, so the vote on the party list. And I feel it's best to use the regional vote percentage because this is what the system is trying to match the seat percentage to as close as possible. So as we can see, the SNP is still overrepresented by about 9 points in terms of its number of MPs compared to its regional vote. But this is clearly far, far less of an overrepresentation than we saw under first past the post. And this kind of 9-point difference for the largest party in Holyrood elections is very much in line with what we've seen in the previous 5 ones. The average is 9.2. So this is a very typical kind of Scottish Parliament election result. And then we can also see, again, which is typical, that the second and third parties get a share of the seats that is very closely matched to the regional votes. And also in this case, the Greens and Lib Dems do in 4th and 5th. And again, this is also similar to previous Scottish Parliament elections is that you then have some really quite small parties at the bottom who don't receive any representation, and on this occasion that's meant that parties receiving 5% of list votes have received no representation. But it is important to note, I think, that the largest single party that received no representation was Alba, and they received only 1.7% of the regional votes. Another way of looking at the overall proportionality of an election outcome is via something called deviation from proportionality score, or a DV score for short. And what this slide is showing is the DV score for the Scottish Parliament elections and the UK general elections in Scotland since 1997. And how a DV score is calculated is quite simple. It's comparing the seat share, the difference between a party's seat share and vote share, and adding up all those differences and then dividing by 2. So the lower a DV score, the more proportional an election outcome overall. And as we can see from those average scores at the bottom, Scottish Parliament elections have a DV score of around 11, and UK general elections have in Scotland, since 97, have a DV score of around 32. So, you know, that's a clearly much more proportional outcome for the Scottish elections, and that's the case across the board if you look at the results from each election going back to 1999 and 1997 for the UK general election. And as part of our report, we wanted to try and give a flavour of voters' experiences of voting under PR systems and how they valued it. So I've just included a few quotes from the report here. So this is Izzy, a voter in Scotland. She said, "I vote in Scotland and I feel like my vote counts for more in our elections. In Westminster, the first past the post system seeks to perpetuate a two-party system, which is no longer the case. It's a massive disservice to the electorate. I'm very politically minded and the UK voting system leaves me feeling utterly disenfranchised." Just moving on now to have a look at some data from Wales. This is quite a busy table, this one, but what it's showing is the difference between the largest parties' seat share and vote share in both Senedd elections held under AMS and UK general elections in Wales held under first past the post. And again, what we can see from the average at the bottom of the table is that the Senedd elections just far more representative of voters' preferences. So since 97 in UK general elections in Wales, the largest party has received on average 71% of the seats on the basis of 44% of the vote, so a difference of nearly 27%. In the Senedd elections, the difference is around half that at 14 points. So on average, the largest party doesn't receive over half the vote seats. They receive 48% of seats on the basis of around 34% of regional votes. So there is still a difference again, but like I said, a lot lower than the difference at UK general elections. Probably is worth pointing out, as I mentioned earlier there, that difference in Wales is higher by about 5 points than it is in Scotland. It's about 9 points in Scotland. And one of the main reasons for that is, like I said, the fact that there are fewer list seats in Wales proportionately than there are in Scotland. So it's harder for those list seats to work and to make the difference and to make the overall outcome as proportional as possible. And I think that's somewhat reflected in Madeline's quote, a voter from Wales. She said, "The May Senedd elections were my first time voting. I was so grateful after doing the vote count in the 2019 general election and seeing so many wasted votes that at least half of my votes could come from what I actually wanted and not tactical voting. Whilst that vote counted, it would feel more valued if there were more seats available on the regional list. And I hope when the Senedd expands, the new members are chosen via PR and not more constituency seats." So finally, moving on to look at some data from the London Assembly elections, and this is a similar table to the last one. And again, it shows that at UK general elections in London since '97, the largest party has received around 66% of the seats on the basis of 46% of the votes. So a difference there of 20 percentage points. And at the London Assembly elections held under AMS, the difference is less than half that at 7 points. So again, similar to the kind of Scottish level of difference. And again, part of the reason for that is that there are a similar number of regional list votes in the London Assembly, regional list seats in the London Assembly as there are in the Scottish Parliament. And then I think another stat from the London Assembly elections which really struck me was that across the 6 London Assembly elections that have been held to date, there have been 84 first past the post contests. And in every single one of those 84, either the Conservatives or Labour have won the first past the post seat. So if the London Assembly was only made up of first past the post seats, then it would just be those 2 party represented. So it's been absolutely crucial to have these additional member seats to ensure that the voters of other parties have been represented on the London Assembly across the last 2 decades. And yeah, just a quote from Stephanie, voter in London: "I felt empowered to vote in the London elections. For once, I didn't feel torn between voting for who I want to vote for and who I have to tactically." So yeah, that was a very common feeling of people that they could actually vote for who they wanted rather than who they thought they had to on a tactical basis across these elections. So just to conclude, obviously, PR for the House of Commons remains a big prize and also a big challenge, but I think it is important to reflect on the fact that there has been progress in Britain over the last 20 years, and we're still seeing some progress, hopefully, for example, in Wales, while of course we should still be cautious about making sure there's no trying to prevent any kind of backsliding along the lines of the suggestion of moving away from the supplementary vote for mayors. But I think while long being an anomaly within Europe, first past the post is starting to become an anomaly even within the UK. And I think we should take some hope from that and keep on our quest to ensure that PR is used across all elections across Britain. So thanks very much for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Ian, for that thorough coverage of the report. And obviously, a lot of numbers are in there, but they're all worth poring over because they all help make the case for what we're arguing for. The report's on our website, by the way. So there's a summary in the blog section of the website, and there's also the full report which you can download and get into the numbers, including the DV scores and other such things that the research team are experts on and very much like. I think to really emphasise what Ian said there, we're all members of the ERS on this call, or very strong supporters, as I mentioned, from the people who were kind enough to donate. So we all believe in this cause very strongly, and we wish it had already happened so that we were out campaigning on other things that we all believe in. But I think what the report reminds us is 2 things. There's just not going to be a big bang moment where suddenly people listen to our arguments and the whole thing collapses and we wake up one morning with STV at the House of Commons. And so part of the desire to do this report was to take a bit of heart from the victories we have had, so that we don't sit around saying, oh, we keep on doing this and nothing happens. Actually, the report's a reminder that we've been successful in arguing for change, and we're going to have a little discussion now about Wales, about some of the things we're pushing it further. But also, I think it's a reminder that for the incremental steps we've got to take, we've got to keep making the arguments where and when we can, and be very realistic and hopeful and enthusiastic about it to push for these changes. So that's I think a good message that the team took when we went through Ian's research and putting together the report together was we can show for voters real change right away in the last 20 years, but it also provides a lot of momentum for what comes next. And just as an example of that, considering that there's a Conservative government at Westminster that's in favour of first past the post and is trying to roll back the supplementary vote, as Ian has said. So, us delivering them an 80-seat Conservative Party majority government, a copy of this report will not make them change their mind. But in the other areas where people are more open to PR, we can have a discussion now about how we're pushing the argument further from beyond, just AMS from 99 on. What are we doing now? So in that respect, I'll say hello to Jess.
Hi, Darren. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And I wonder whether you could just talk to us about some of the changes, because the Welsh Senedd looks like a completely different institution than the one that started back in 1999.
Absolutely. So any Welsh viewers will probably roll their eyes when I say this, but there's an often used phrase in Welsh politics that was said by Ron Davies, former Secretary of State for Wales, around it being a process, not an event. And we've really seen that in the Senedd. We've seen a assembly created in 1999 with very few powers, based on a very, very slim margin in support in terms of a referendum. And that really has grown over the years. So we've now seen another referendum in 2011 about legislative powers, tax varying powers, and the Senedd officially becoming a parliament. And it's really that kind of change and that pace and that process that is now allowing us to talk further about how we evolve our Senedd even more and make it more fit for the people who live in Wales.
And as that time has gone on, has public support built up or ebbed away, or just disinterest? But what would be the best way of thinking about that?
Yeah, so from a very, very slim majority in 1999 in the 2011 referendum, you had a much higher majority, around 64%. What we have had an issue with in Wales is a little bit of like a lack of interest or a democratic deficit, let's say, with a kind of poor media, lack of political education, and all of that really, I think, has led to questions about how actually the Senedd can make its mark on the people of Wales and, show a little bit more heft and really, really reflect the people that live here.
And what's changed that, do you think? Well, what's led to some of that more sense of engagement or sense of ownership of the institution?
It's a funny one. I think the context in Wales has changed. Obviously, when we had the Assembly, as it was then known, first established, you had a Labour government both in Westminster and Labour having a majority of seats, or the largest seats, in Wales in the Senedd as the Assembly, as it was then known. So there's an element of, our governments have kind of changed across the nations, but also I think that there's a real shift in Welsh Labour in particular that we've particularly seen with Mark Drakeford's leadership, where he's very much come in looking at how he can actually reform democracy, really. We had a statement 2 weeks ago from the new Counsel General, Mick Antonev, laying out 4 things they were going to do to reform the Senedd. And they were looking at things like changing accessibility in terms of voting, doing big communications plans about registration. And I think that is how we need to look at Senedd reform. It's part of a parcel of these things. It's a really wide kind of basket of offers around democracy, and not just kind of one thing.
I remember Mark Drakeford, before he was First Minister, being a guest of the ERS at I think 1 or 2 events that we put on at Westminster, and he spoke glowingly about the STV voting system. So I'm hoping that now that he's First Minister, he'll continue with that support. But of course, he's got to persuade his party, and we can come on to that as well, because there's often groups within groups and political parties that come in there. A couple of things you said there struck a chord with me. One was the parties at Westminster in government versus the parties in the nations, because that's quite an interesting dynamic. It often happens in federal government systems with states being one way and the feds being the other. But that's been a real feature of the last 20 years. But with respect to Wales, you've had a Labour majority government, then a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, and then a Conservative majority government. Three different styles of government, all devolving more powers and more say to the people of Wales through the Senedd. So that's quite an interesting dynamic, that it's played out along, it hasn't played out along party lines, it's played out much more for the citizen, which I think is a really encouraging thing. You mentioned also a parcel of measures, and I wanted to pick up on that because you did a lot of work on the size of the Assembly, and as Ian's report shows, with only 60 members and the proportional members only being 20, it means there is a gap between the vote and the seat share, which is very concerning. It's better than first past the post. We always have to remember that, but it's not as far as we would like things. Would like things to go. But I also remember that when we started campaigning on the size of the Assembly, some of our supporters said, "Oh, that's a distraction from the big thing." But do you want to talk about maybe the expert panel on electoral reform and how we were able to sort of get some of our items on the agenda through that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the interesting thing about increasing the size of the Assembly is then you automatically have that question, oh, how does that larger Senedd get elected? And that's what's allowed us really to bring in conversations around STV. So in 2017, Wales had powers devolved over elections, and for the first time could really think about how to make a democracy fit for the country. And as such commissioned, well, the Senedd itself, the commissioned a expert panel for Senedd reform, chaired by Professor Laura McAllister, and we worked really closely with them. Laura and ERS have worked very, very closely over the past few years. We gave lots of evidence to them and kind of supported their conclusions. And they recommended a series of reforms, that package that I was really referring to, which included votes at 16, increased size of the Senedd to 80 to 90 members, STV, and integrated gender quotas. And really they got to STV because of some kind of key principles around proportionality, but also diversity, a kind of equal mandate, and STV really ticked the boxes for all of those things, and that is their preferred option. Since then, only one of those things, votes of 16, has actually been implemented. But last year, a Senedd committee chaired by a Labour member, who's now a minister in government, recommended exactly the same thing. And I think that really gave us a bit of momentum to lead up to the Senedd elections earlier in May, influencing parties, lobbying, and really kind of speaking to them and encouraging them to back these recommendations. And 3 of the 4 parties that won seats actually did back further reform, and I think that's led us now to a really good place where we can hopefully move forward on this.
And those two processes combined, that the committee on the reform of the Senedd plus the expert panel have dovetailed in quite nicely as well, haven't they? So if we think about the local government change, obviously Ian mentioned in Scotland the local government STV came about for everybody, for all councils. As a result of that coalition between Labour and the Liberal Democrats. But in Wales, it's the permissive system. So do you want to just say a word about that to explain just the differences and what that will mean for how we approach the campaign there to achieve STV in local government?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a unique system that we're moving towards in Wales for local elections. So the Local Government and Elections Wales Act received royal assent just last year, actually. It feels like 10 years ago, but it really wasn't. And that will allow, following May's elections next year, councils to choose whether they stick with first past the post or move to STV. And I think this kind of moves back to that saying about process, not an event. And that's how things are kind of done in Wales. It's been very peaceful in terms of devolution, and we're getting there, but it's taken us quite a long time. So the way we're seeing this is very much we need to see councils leading the way. A few councils choosing to move to STV, demonstrating to the rest of what can be a pretty traditional local government in Wales, demonstrating to the rest of the authorities about the benefits that PR STV brings you. If you're looking at proportionality, looking at diversity, STV will make an impact in all of those areas. So we are working really, really closely with councils at the moment, trying to identify those that we think are most likely to move to an STV system, and working with them to kind of do mostly a lot of evidence building and a lot of fact finding for them, because voting systems isn't necessarily something that every councillor in Wales knows about. So we need to have a conversation about showing the benefits with councillors across Wales in those areas we think could really bite the bullet and do it.
Yes, well, I know it's often a concern people have is that if we've ended up with all these one-party states and you ask them all to change, that they've got excuses as to why everyone else's council should change, but not their one. And I think that kind of sort of a mixture of NIMBYism, and as one of our members have said, the old line, I think it's John, says, "Why would turkeys vote for an early Christmas?" This is one of the fault lines in the debate that we have to work our way through. In the English context, we can go to the two major parties and say, look, you might get more seats on councils at the other end of England from where your support base is, but you've got to give up these, ridiculous super majorities that bear no reflection to your vote share in order to do it. Then if you've relying on each individual council, there is a dilemma there. So how do you think we can work our way through that in Wales, given that's the situation we've got? We can't make it any different than that. That's what the law is. We have to respond to that reality. How are we positioning ourselves on that?
Yeah, I think obviously, we gave evidence to the committee looking at the bill. We worked very closely with Welsh Government, and it was quite clear that our preferred option would have been STV for all local authorities in Wales. But we've worked with successive ministers, and they were very resistant to mandate a changing voting system, and they really want to actually see councils evolve and support. So we recently met with the new local government minister, and she's very pro-PR, and she really supports our efforts of working with councillors, especially around education, and wanted to work with us. So asked her civil servants to set up a meeting with us to talk about how we can do a little bit more information driving across local authorities in Wales. And then there's kind of two different other approaches. So working individually with councillors, groups, trying to build up support in a number of councils that may be more likely to vote for it. So I'm thinking particularly those authorities maybe that are led by parties that endorse STV on a general basis, like Plaid Cymru. So identifying those councils, but also working with the parties more broadly to try and get them in the Senedd advocating for this and talking to members that are further down the line in local authority. So it's a real two kind of track process of working directly with councils and then working with government and parties to try and broaden support.
It does feel like this is one of the best opportunities we've had in quite some time to get some more runs on the board. And we've always felt that the more we get, the more we can show how this works and works well. And although there's a change for incumbent politicians and a change for parties, people adapt remarkably quickly to that from that point of view as the decision makers, but also the voters get to see the big advantage, and that's what this is all for. It's what part of the argument for the votes at 16 that you mentioned as well, that's now happening around the UK, and we were able to say to England, and when we're making these arguments in England, there are so many differences in the franchise, the system of voting, etc., than what there is, and I think for people who are on the unionist side of the argument, of which there are lots of people in England, these are some of the arguments that we can try and attach our democratic reforms to. So we're hopeful that the work you're doing, ERS Cymru, the work you're doing both for the local authorities and for the Senedd itself will bear some real fruit. So thank you for sharing that with us. And we'll now move to some questions. And Ian, I'm going to just throw 2 or 3 to you so that you can write them down, because obviously we're all in different places. But there's a question from Malcolm about turnout under proportional representation. There's one from Marcus on any international evidence on smaller constituencies and fewer representatives. That's sometimes the trend that you'll see there, and also from Rachel about how AMS seats are decided, because that was in your report. And then if I just did you get all those ones? Great. All right. Well, then I'll give you some time to organise on that, and I'll just go through a couple that I looked at before. So Christopher was asking about how we're explaining and promoting the STV system of PR is the best system of PR throughout the whole UK. Well, hopefully that's been addressed with the session we've just had on what we've done in Wales, our achievement previously in Scotland, even on some failed projects like the elected House of Lords back in 2012. We were successful in getting STV as the proposed system for being used there, and of course we're advocating for the use of the STV system, but we have to start where things are in each of the nations. So in a way, from the perspective of this question, this report kind of is a nice arc of where there was first past the post in 1999. There were none of these devolved institutions. Then they came along. They were chosen using AMS. That's now had 20 years. Now you see in Wales where the discussion has kind of got to. Titus asks about the breakdown of MPs who support proportional representation, and there was another question that came in from somebody who, I'm afraid to say, it was only a lot of numbers. It wasn't a name, so I can't recognise you in that sense. But it was asking about how it's going with our campaign within Labour and with the Labour conference coming up. And on Titus's point, yes, we know where a lot of MPs stand. Some MPs have no opinion, and of course, in the last 2 or 3 years, because we've had 2 general elections, the Commons has changed a lot, and our some of our lobbying has been hindered by not being able to get to conferences and events and things like that. But we do know where our supporters are. We also know what our opponents are doing and saying. And Ian referenced the Home Secretary in a fairly powerful position who wants to move away from supplementary votes for the PCCs and the mayors and move back to first past the post. So that's a really worrying example where we're not on the edge of getting STV there. We're on the edge of going back to first past the post. And I think any campaigning organisation needs to be looking both ways. How do you get to your goal, but how do you make sure you don't go backwards? So we do work with MPs who are supportive of us. We've set up an all-party parliamentary group to try and coordinate there. Within the Labour Party, which is obviously a focus for us to try and get their position to change, we're part of an umbrella group of many very good organisations that set up Labour for a New Democracy, and they've been making the case for getting resolutions from local Labour parties to push through into the conference process, but also providing a platform for people on the Labour Party who care about getting a change to bring them together in an area where we can make some progress. And we've for some time now, as part of that or preceding that grouping coming together, we're working in politics for the many, which was a trade union based campaign to get the trade unions to change positions as well. So across where all those power parts lay, MPs, party supporters, trade unions, journalists, academics, we try and identify our supporters and work it hard. You asked what would sway them. Well, there's a multiplicity of arguments, and that's why we try and attach other things to our central message in order to be able to open up conversations and develop that with politicians, because there are very few people who are just interested in one narrow thing. They're generally interested in a pile of issues, and you've got to try and make sure that you're talking broadly across those. I might, Ian, now go to you just to deal with those 3 questions, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Darren. Yeah, so Malcolm's question about turnout under PR and whether it raises turnout. I'm not aware of any empirical data that definitely confirms this. It's very difficult to tease out the reasons why turnout might increase or decrease between elections in different contexts with people, the importance or the closeness of an election. So I think it's very difficult to empirically prove that. I think what you can say is, from the qualitative evidence of some of those quotes that we saw in my slides, that for at least some people, they really do feel that it makes a difference, and it encouraged them to feel that their vote counts. So yeah, it's a tricky one to prove, but I think there's definite evidence that for a lot of people it does make a difference. In terms of Marcus's question about a drift to smaller constituencies under STV, I'm not aware of international examples, but I do know that in Scotland, there was a reform. I think the legislation passed in 2019, which did allow for the number of councillors per ward to move from being either 3 or 4 to between 2 and 5. So that has extended that flexibility both at the bottom end and at the upper end. And obviously there is a trade-off there in terms of if there are some wards which only have 2 councillors, that will make things somewhat less proportional. I think the reason they went for that were particular cases. There's obviously a lot of rural parts of Scotland which are really not very populated, and it can be hard for it can make sense perhaps to give that flexibility to allow just 2 per ward, but there is definitely a trade-off there. They also have increased it at the upper end and to 5. So if there are any which move to having 5, that would probably increase the proportionality in those areas. And then Rachel's question about how the proportion of in AMS, how the proportion of first past the post and list seats are decided. For all of these bodies, that was decided in the legislation that was passed through the UK Parliament when these bodies were set up. So that decision was taken back in the 1990s and has been the same ever since. So as we can see now with Wales, there's now some talk about changing that, and it's now the responsibility of the Senedd to do that, and it would be also the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament if they were to consider making any changes to their own electoral system. And in terms of London, it is still in the gift of the UK government at Westminster.
Great, Ian, thanks. Jess, I think you had a question to you about some ideas for local government in Wales.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, just check who it was. Jennifer asked about approaching officials in local government, and that is a great idea. It's something that we've been looking at. We are very aware that with council elections next year, and then they're immediately having to go into this decision about changing systems, that councillors may change. The ones that we're speaking to now might not stand again, they might lose their seats. So actually working with officials is a way of kind of ensuring that continuity. So we are planning to do that, definitely. We're working quite closely with the WLGA, which the Welsh Local Government Association, so similar to COSLA that you'd have in Scotland. And we're working with them quite closely on a number of issues, particularly diversity. So we've got good inroads there, and we're hoping to use that to really make sure our plan here is delivered.
Great, thanks, Jess. I see there's also a question from Philip about the pandemic. So, Jess, do you want to have a look at that one, and I'll just answer Ian's question about the London Council wards being generally 3 per ward, or at least multi-member wards, and whether or not they could be easily converted to STV. And I think that's exactly right. I think the argument becomes a little easier in the cities when they're already used to city voters are already used to multi-member wards in a lot of cases, and so for opponents of change, they say, well, the wards have become too big, et cetera, et cetera. In the cities, people are already used to having multiple councillors, and I think if they were made, obviously, the bigger they become, the more number of members that are elected, the more those voter preferences can be reflected in cities. So that even in cities where there might be one party that's got parts of cities where there might be one party that's particularly dominant, there's still the opportunity for some parties to get a representation. And of course, that builds up the argument for having oppositions and scrutiny in local government, which has been something that's often missing. As the last few years, there's been quite a large change away from Westminster sending powers and pounds out to city regions, for example, where there's no opposition for scrutiny. That's been a bad thing. Thankfully, that's actually helped us recruit more people to the cause. Jess, do you want to come in on that question I mentioned?
Yeah, so Philip's question was about attitudes to politics and the democratic system in terms of how they've changed during the pandemic. And obviously, hopefully it's okay that I talk about Wales here, because I've not really left in the last 18 months for pandemic related reasons. But I think the big change here that the pandemic has kind of caused is a heightened awareness of devolution. One of the big things that we've been aware of since devolution in Wales is that a lot of people in Wales aren't really aware of the Senedd and what it does. And over the course of the past 18 months, you've obviously seen the First Minister, the Health Minister on your TV screens and your newspapers every single day talking about vital decisions that are made here in Wales. And that's led to, I think, a lot more awareness around who actually is making decisions here. And I think that, combined with a successful election for Labour in May, after making all those decisions, almost legitimised these things that we're talking about in terms of reform. And it made the First Minister, Mark Drake, be very confident, I think, post-election, in saying, actually, we do need a larger Senedd. You know, he's got that popularity to almost kind of tide over these kind of difficult questions. So that's been, I think, a real change, but it's one that's potentially quite welcome for us, especially, you know, as we're obviously supportive of more people being aware of who exactly is making decisions about their lives.
Great, thanks, Jess. Ian, can I point you to Kirsten's question and also to John's question? And then while you're doing that, I'll just say Michael's asked about citizens' assemblies to promote PR. That's certainly something that we would be in favour of, because remember, you know, a decade ago we went down the referendum route, and part of the reason why we support more deliberative democratic techniques like citizens' assemblies is that we think it's a great example of a tool that can be used for randomly selected citizens to come together and go through something you know, as technical but important and very, you know, values based as the voting system. So we're very much in favour of that as a way of both bringing democratic legitimacy to the decision, but also being able to explore how citizens come to the conclusion that we've all come to, which has led us to being on that call, on this call. There's a couple of questions from David and from I saw it earlier on about Peter, about first past the post, and what arguments get used there to promote that. And I think one of the things that we've been able to in the last few years argue back against is this notion of strong and stable government, because it hasn't really felt much like that for a while. And I think the other thing that gets argued for in favour is they mention constituency links, for example. But I think what both Ian's report shows is that there is a mix of first past the post seats and list seats under AMS, and of course under STV, they're all geographically based community linked seats that are chosen. So I think the other thing is that people say about first past the post, people understand it more and more than other systems. But again, I think we can come back, and this conversation we're having right now is a demonstration of that. But you know, as David says, on the principle of know your enemy, try and know what the arguments are on the other side. And we know that, you know, it's not a case of us delivering a lecture and then people say, yes, we agree. There were people pushing back and debating and sometimes misrepresenting, as we saw a decade ago. So those are things we have to be aware of. Ian, can I come to you?
Yeah, so John asked a question or made a point about it being difficult to defend the supplementary vote system when it has the defect of asking people only to make only one second preference, when most of those other candidates would have been eliminated, and it's just the top two that go through. And I think that's a very fair point, and we definitely wouldn't be promoting, you know, we're not saying that the supplementary vote is a wonderful system by any means. I think it would be much better in those elections for one candidate like the London Mayor if people could list as many preferences as they wanted, and have them all taken into account and the vote you know, done along those lines. I think what we would say is that even taking that into account, we would regard SV still as preferable to first past the post, in that it is providing some extra level of preference for the voter and giving them the opportunity to think, well, I'd really like to vote for this person, but I have still got this backup second vote. So it's certainly not perfect, but it's something where we'd be concerned to see a shift from that back towards first past the post. And then in terms of Kirsten's question regarding if the Home Secretary can change the voting system for mayors and police and crime commissioners back to first past the post, why do we need a referendum to change to PR, and could Parliament similarly change our electoral system without the need for a referendum? And the short answer to that is yes, they could. There's nothing to say that a referendum is required to change the voting system. It's, you know, it could be done by an act of Parliament. I think there's a debate to be had about, you know, the process that we might not want. We've talked about citizens' assemblies there, and whether that might be a route to go down to try and build support and that amongst the public, and that's perhaps a possible route. But the short answer is that there is no absolute need for a referendum.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the mention of the Citizens' Assembly. It's also one of our strategic goals in our new plan is to try and convince one of the two major parties to shift their position in their manifesto. So if we went into a general election and one of the major parties had it in their manifesto, plus all the smaller parties, particularly the ones from the nations that support PR as well, then you'd have a majority of MPs representing a majority of voters able to have the democratic mandate. But also, if there's a hung parliament, there's the Citizens' Assembly route as well. I also just want to say to our member Bart, who's made a very good point about us being able to use charts as well, just from a visual point of view. We'll take that on board for the future. Thank you for that. And Glenn asks about how to persuade friends who are in favour of PR, even intelligent ones who don't always see the immediate logic or what it is that we're promoting, and how to persuade them. Well, I guess in one way, this report is quite a helpful thing because it shows what's happening in actual fact, in reality, for millions of people living in the same country. Also, there's a lot of international evidence of countries that have moved away from first past the post to different systems where seats match votes, and how successful that's been. No one ever really wants to go back. But then also our blogs and social media channels often have good snippets of information and more bite-sized pieces. If they don't want to wade through big long reports, then we've got the full suite of options for them to look at. So I'd encourage you to do that. That's just over an hour up now, so I want to keep to time as much as we can. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Really great to see that the interest is there in the report as we carry on our campaign, and also to know that for millions of people in the UK already using proportional representation in its various forms, they are getting the benefit of a much more enhanced democracy. So the work of the ERS to carry that on for the House of Commons continues. Thank you very much to my colleagues for joining me, those who you can see, and for the colleagues who have been behind the scenes trying to keep all the tech working well. And I think we've pretty much got there on everything. So thank you, a big thank you to them for that as well. Take care and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.